Good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Kevin Jennings. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the CEO of Lambda Legal, coming to you from New York City. Tonight's webinar is going to talk about the 10th anniversary of the Obergefell decision, which gave us marriage equality 10 years ago tomorrow. But we have to start by acknowledging that the Supreme Court gave us some disheartening news last week when, in the case we brought with the ACLU, LW versus Scrimetti, which later became United States versus Scrimetti, was decided against us 6-3. We're going to talk a little bit about that case as well tonight, in addition to focusing on the history and future of marriage. But I think it's important actually to do a little history right now, because in this moment when we've suffered a setback, we can actually learn something from the history of marriage equality. You know, one of the things that I always find somewhat hilarious is people say, well, marriage equality happened so quickly. Not exactly. The first people that we know of to request a wedding certificate, a wedding license, of the same sex were Michael McConnell and Jack Baker in Minnesota back in 1971. They were able to get one because they did a little skullduggery and used a gender neutral name to make it look like they were an opposite sex couple. When Hennepin County found out that they had done so and they were actually of the same sex, they invalidated the wedding license, and Jack and Michael went to court, but they were unsuccessful. Fast forward 22 years to Hawaii, where these three couples brought a lawsuit which asked the state to grant marriage equality. And the state found that they actually had to hear the lawsuit. It was the first time there'd ever been a favorable ruling that said that this was a serious issue that courts had to consider. In the end, they were not successful because the Hawaii court decided to let a ban on same-sex marriage that had been passed by the legislature stand. And there was a national reaction as well in the form of what we call the Defense of Marriage Act, which was an act passed through Congress and signed by President Bill Clinton, that said that you did not have to recognize same-sex marriages. 10 years later in Massachusetts, our colleagues at Glad Law brought Goodridge versus the Department of Public Health on behalf of these two women, Hillary and Julie Goodridge, who had been denied a wedding license. They argued that they had been denied a wedding license on the basis of their sex. They were both women, and the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court agreed. And for the first time, a court held that a state had to grant marriage equality to same-sex couples. America didn't react well to this. I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. In many states, there were efforts made to amend state constitutions to ban same-sex marriage. And in what was a really devastating blow, as Jenny can relate, being based in Los Angeles, California passed Proposition 8 in 2008. In fact, by 2008, there were 27 states, all of the red states, had passed constitutional bans on same-sex marriage. We did not give up. As you're going to hear tonight from the Barnums, we went to court in Iowa and we won. Here's a lovely picture of the family celebrating the victory. I'm sorry, this picture always makes me smile. And then we were able to get back to the Supreme Court in Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, when the court ruled 10 years ago tomorrow that marriage equality was the law of the land. What is the point of my history lesson? By the way, Jack and Michael are still around, and finally their wedding was validated back in 2019. So after 50 years, they have been able to celebrate the marriage they were entitled to all along. The point of my little history presentation here was that this was not quick. This was not easy. This was not linear. This was a process where there were setbacks, there was heartbreak, there were defeats, But we learned an important lesson in this fight, this almost 50-year fight for marriage equality. And it's this: if we persist, we will prevail. Persistence may take a long time. After all, Lambda Legal started its marriage project in the early 90s, and we didn't achieve final victory until 2015. But if we persist, we are going to prevail. That's a very, very important lesson as we are in a scary and dark time right now. We have been in scary and dark times before. We kept persisting, and we did prevail. So I'm going to invite my colleagues, Jenny Pizer and Camilla Taylor, to rejoin us. Hi, Jenny. Hi, Camilla. Before we dig into the history and future of marriage equality, Camilla, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about, before we do a little more history, let's do some current events. So obviously, anyone who cares about LGBTQ plus equality is thinking right now about last week's decision in the Scrimeti case at the Supreme Court. Can you tell us what exactly was decided and what does this mean for our movement?
Thanks, Kevin. Well, the Scrimeti case was a heartbreaking loss for families in Tennessee. It was deeply disappointing. And as folks may remember, this was our challenge to a law in Tennessee that banned medical treatment for gender dysphoria for transgender young people. And this was one of a series of laws that passed in recent years in state legislatures targeting transgender youth and taking away their medically necessary health care, which in many cases can be life-saving. It's extremely important health care. We challenged the Tennessee law in addition to challenging multiple other laws, and we are almost routinely successful in lower courts in getting injunctions that prevent those bans from going into effect, because lower courts have the opportunity to hear from experts, medical doctors, and from our families themselves, the transgender young people who are affected and their parents, and to assess their credibility and their need for this care. However, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals delivered us a broad and vicious ruling that was a loss, and we petitioned for certiorari to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court also gave us a loss, but on much, much narrower grounds. And in fact, if we were to get a loss from the Supreme Court, this is about the narrowest loss we could get. This is one of a series of cases in which the Supreme Court has delivered a loss to LGBTQ litigants in recent years, but then cabined that ruling so that it really applies only to the particular litigants in the case, or in this case, only to the Tennessee law that was challenged. And here's why. The Supreme Court was explicit that this ruling applies only to equal protection claims involving minors and their health care needs, where there's no evidence of animus driving passage of the law, and where the plaintiffs are not arguing that the law itself served as a proxy for targeting transgender people's personhood. Now, we can dispute what the Tennessee law did and whether it was motivated by animus, but this is what the Supreme Court held, which means that in many other cases, we retain the tools to be able to challenge anti-transgender discrimination. The Supreme Court was explicit in saying that all of the precedents that we've built in the last 20 years at appeals courts that hold that laws targeting trans people are presumptively unconstitutional, those remain. So we live to fight another day. This case is pretty limited exclusively to the context of this law in Tennessee. While it's heartbreaking, there are many other ways that we can continue to challenge anti-transgender laws going forward, and we're continuing to fight.
Thank you, Camilla. So to transition back from current events to the history, we're going to talk a little bit about the struggle for marriage equality. And Jenny, you were involved with that pretty much from the start. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how Lambda Legal strategy evolved over the 2 decades we worked on this issue.
Well, so Kevin, I'll start by saying I wasn't there at the very start back in the 70s. However,
I was thinking of the start at Lambda Legal.
Well, and so I was around in the mid 80s when Lambda Legal led a movement-wide debate about whether the freedom to marry was a worthy goal for our movement, where our legal director and our executive director put the arguments out there and engaged the broader community in that discussion. And that was taking place at a time, and I had to look this up, I don't remember it personally, but there was really only about 10% support for marriage equality in the country at that time in the 80s. And we're going to talk about it a good bit in this webinar today, but I can't resist making a plug for chapter 6 of our anniversary book, which is all about the work of Lambda Legal over these decades to win the freedom to marry. And you can find Making the Case for Equality at your fine bookstores everywhere. So be excited by this webinar and then learn more in the book. So I think what I want to say in terms of how our work evolved over time is that it was partly a function of members of our community having more and more support and ability to come out and to talk about why marriage equality and sort of inclusion and protection of the family code and recognition within our families and society were so important. You know, it was partly our whole movement evolving and making it possible for more people to participate and tell their stories of why this matters. But it was also a function of the types of attacks that we were dealing with and the issues that were so front and center, the needs of our community. You know, we always have to recognize the extraordinary trauma that our community went through, starting in the mid 80s and well into, you know, the 90s, and still of HIV and AIDS. And what happened to our community of having long-term couples with one or both partners in the couple getting sick and not having access to medical care through employment, not having access to the bedside when somebody was sick, losing an apartment because the relationship wasn't recognized. You know, the need for legal recognition and protection was so stark, and it pushed people to come out and fight and to organize. And this issue became salient, you know, in parallel tracks. Lambda Legal led work and worked with partners, both to articulate why our relationships deserve legal protection and inclusion in law, and also that we could and needed to fight issue by issue at the same time for the ability to make medical decisions, for the ability to inherit property, for the ability to have health insurance, one for the other, through work or however. And the early days of the work and the work that Lambda Legal led through, as you mentioned, Kevin, creating the Marriage Project, was about creating a national coalition, the Freedom to Marry Coalition, that was really about bringing this issue forward at a time when even as we made our way into the early 90s with the Hawaii case, within our own LGBTQ plus community, we had maybe 35% support. So there needed to be this engagement. As is often said, you know, there's hardly ever any marriage without engagement. We needed to have engagement. We needed to have organizing, and we needed to have stories. And meanwhile, in the beginning, and in a second, I'll ask Camilla to talk about a shift that happened, but we didn't talk as much about parents and kids. And I think there were a couple of important reasons for that. And one was, you know, the horrifying, hideous smears that our community had dealt with for many decades, accusing, smearing LGBT people as being child molesters and child predators. And so, you know, I know, Kevin, this is something that you dealt with as a teacher, the fear that so many teachers lived with of being outed and immediately fired because of that pervasive false, you know, prejudice type of accusation that was advanced by people like Anita Bryant and John Briggs and others, sort of demagogues who reinforced that slander. And, you know, we had gay dads and lesbian moms trying to maintain relationships with their kids at a point when they came out and were in a same-sex relationship. And the courts were very hostile to those parents for quite a while. And we didn't have the research in the early days to show that those accusations were just nonsense, they were false, and that it's terrible for kids to lose relationships with the parents who have loved them and raised them, cared for them so well because of sexual orientation bias. So in the early days, we focused more on adult relationships and the unjustifiable, cruel harms of denying any legal protection. But over time, the opposition focused more and more on ostensible needs of kids as a justification, and not just of kids, but kids where there is a biological tie between a child and both parents, both genetic or biological parents, picking the one thing that usually distinguishes same-sex couples from different-sex couples and making that into the entire argument. And there was so much illogic to it, so much cruelty to it. And, there came a time when we were able to, when we had to tackle that head on and point out how illogical it was, and when we were able to do it really effectively. Camilla, you were one of the leading voices calling out the need to make that shift and the confidence that it was time to make that shift. I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit about that.
Sure, Jenny. Well, first, we began to have anecdotal evidence that it was very powerful to ask Americans to view marriage discrimination through the eyes of the children of same-sex couples. And for example, when we were litigating a marriage equality case in Iowa, we were working with a lovely lesbian couple who had 2 young daughters, and they would tell a story when we went to editorial board meetings to reporters about how they were looking for a preschool in which to enroll their older child. And when they found a place that seemed like it would be awesome and they were about to write the check, they thought to ask the head administrator of the preschool, is there any way that our daughter would be treated differently because she has same-sex parents? And the administrator thought for a moment and then said, well, she wouldn't be permitted to give a presentation on her family during the unit on families. And this couple then had this realization that their daughter would be the only kid who would be forced to stand silent, listening to all of the presentations about other families, but would be shamed into silence because she would be told by the school, in effect, that there was something wrong with her family. And they fought for the freedom to marry in part because they didn't want their daughter to get the message that there was something wrong with her and her own family. And as we began to tell this story, it was clear that it had a great deal of impact. And we were facing at that time a lot of polling data that suggested if you ask the American public, should same-sex couples be allowed to have children, or should they have children, which was the common way that that question was formulated, we would lose. There would be something like 75 or 85% sometimes opinion against us, suggesting that the American public disapproved of same-sex couples having children. But we realized if you ask a different question, if you say, Robert is 6 years old and he has 2 moms, would it benefit Robert if his moms were able to marry? You would get 85% support for the freedom to marry in order to benefit Robert. And we began to realize that a lot of the arguments about how marriage is for the purpose of benefiting children who are procreated accidentally, or who children need a mommy and a daddy, if children can become plaintiffs in those marriage equality cases themselves, then courts will have to answer why those children should be shut out of the rights, the benefits of marriage, and why those children should be shamed by being told that their families were inferior. So that was kind of a turning point for us. And at around 2009, 2008, we began asking those questions very seriously. And sometimes children were also plaintiffs in our marriage equality cases as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to go directly to a question about public opinion. I always say we work in 2 court systems, the court of law and the court of public opinion. What role did public opinion play in Lambda Legal strategy and eventual victory? Jenny, would you like to take that one?
Sure. Well, I mean, we've always recognized, we're Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund, and we always recognize that it's judges are people too, and we have to persuade. People have to understand, including judges have to understand why one group of people is like another group of people in the relevant ways when we're asking for equality, when we're asking for freedom. They have to understand that we're entitled to be equal with our differences and to make those arguments. And so it's always been a core part of our work, whether it's with the Freedom to Marry Coalition, with the town halls, including 5 years worth of town halls in every corner of the wonderful state of Iowa, for just to pick one example. We had so much of that happening in the state of California. And you could chart, and you can chart, whether it's in Gallup or Pew or any other polling, the steady increase in public support for the freedom to marry over time, as we did more and more of this work, as more people understood that this was the right answer. So the cases have always been about educating the courts and the broader public. And that's part of why in many, many of our cases, we didn't just have one couple or one survivor who wanted to be recognized. We often had a dozen or a dozen and a half different families to show the different types of needs, different ages, all across the state, to show that kind of representation, because all of those stories were part of the concerted strategy, so that everybody could see why this was the right answer. Courts usually are not too far ahead of public opinion. We know that. But when they are, and we have a wonderful victory, then to hold on to it, we need to have public support. And the other part of this, I think, is it's not just winning in court. The goal is that people should have rights and then be treated properly according to the law and in our day-to-day lives. That does depend on people understanding what the law is and understanding that that's the right answer. So one of the things today, if we look at the polls, is that it's close to 70% public support for marriage equality. It's been pretty stable at that point for quite a few years. That's very reassuring. What's a little bit less reassuring is we're seeing a bigger gap between support by people who self-identify as Democrats and people who self-identify as Republicans. Republican support actually has been dipping, and that's something that we take seriously as part of the current political climate. So we keep our eye on the polls, and we keep our eye on other measures of where the American public is. But marriage equality at this point has strong public support, and that's because of the plaintiffs, the stories, and the work that the entire movement has done over these decades.
Camilla, you were director of the Marriage Project at one point, and I'm curious if you could just give people a little insight. How did you pick where to bring lawsuits and why?
Oh, that's a great question, Kevin. There were many factors that we considered, and I think it's wonderful to do this exploration of the struggle, because this was a long fight, as you pointed out, and there were many different losses and milestones along the way before we began to win some significant victories. And we knew, as Jenny was saying, that it was important to bring public opinion along with us, but that didn't happen overnight. So first of all, when we were thinking about where to bring a lawsuit, we focused on state courts, and we focused on states where there was a tradition of interpreting the state constitution as having broader guarantees than the federal constitution, a tradition of independence, because we were asking these state high courts to rule that their state constitution guaranteed the freedom to marry before the federal high court has said so. And the other thing that we had to keep in mind when trying to bring a case is, of course, whether there's a tradition of ruling favorably on the equal protection guarantee or the due process guarantee on which we were relying, but also, so civil rights precedents, how did the court rule in those contexts? But also, we had to think about what would happen if we won. If we won a high court victory requiring the issuance of marriage licenses to same-sex couples, understanding that at the time we were bringing many of these cases, public opinion was not yet firmly with us in the majority, we had to be concerned about whether that public could enact a referendum that could amend that state constitution, not only to roll back any victory we won, but potentially to do even greater harm. So we had to consider the process for amending a state constitution and the likelihood that a constitutional amendment would pass if we were fortunate enough to get a win. There were a lot of things that we thought about. We also had to be considerate of the incredibly brave plaintiffs who stepped forward and said, we wish to sue, because they knew that they were going to be the public face of marriage litigation. It was their job to introduce themselves to the American public. And we had to be very respectful of where there were folks who were willing to step up and play that role. We're about to meet an incredible couple who played that role very bravely. And not everyone can do that. That is a huge, courageous act to participate in.
Yeah, I mean, I have to always say the plaintiffs of Lambda Legal are real heroes. They put themselves out there at great personal risk, not just for themselves, but for the whole community. So we're really grateful for their courage. To ask you another question, Camilla, the case we're celebrating, Obergefell, it's decided 10 years ago tomorrow. What was the story behind that specific case, and why was it the one that got to the Supreme Court?
Well, we won a lot of significant victories before state courts, and there were other states that enacted marriage legislation and brought the freedom to marry through state legislation. And then the Supreme Court issued a decision in Windsor, which required the federal government to respect state law marriages validly entered into. And after that, it became clear that it was time to go to federal court, and it was time to seek the freedom to marry as a matter of federal constitutional guarantees. And there were cases that proceeded on the West Coast, on the East Coast, and everywhere in between. And we began winning, and we just kept winning. And there were federal circuit court victories for same-sex couples in our cases in the Fourth Circuit, in the Seventh Circuit, in the Ninth Circuit. And all of these went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court let them stand. In the Tenth Circuit as well, there was a wonderful victory. Then, unfortunately, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals heard a combination of consolidated cases that came out of Ohio and Tennessee, Kentucky, and Michigan, and delivered us a loss. So here was a circuit split, which forced the Supreme Court to take the case. Obergefell reflected cases brought by Lambda Legal, the ACLU, NCLR, and GLAAD. And so all of these impact litigation organizations serving the LGBTQ community were up before the Supreme Court together. We were vindicated in a wonderful decision by Justice Kennedy, reflecting the majority, and that then required the freedom to marry to be the law of the land nationwide.
Jenny, it's 10 years later now. We all remember I think many of us remember exactly where we were the moment Obergefell was decided. I think many of us remember that night when the White House was lit up in rainbow colors, and it was just such a joyous day. 10 years later, a lot of people are very nervous about that we're in a very different situation now. Is Obergefell under threat today? And if yes, how is it under threat?
Yeah, well, it's been quite a decade, and it's been a decade of now untold numbers of same-sex couples marrying and raising their families and having the protection and the recognition of marriage equality. It's been really important. There are quite a few of us who have really benefited from that, and we have had two members of our current Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court today is more conservative than it's been any time in my lifetime, and I would include that even in the mid 80s when we had a horrible, insulting decision about criminal laws. I think it's more conservative than it's been in my lifetime. And two members of the court have taken an opportunity back in 2020 to express in a very unusual statement in a case where somebody was trying to get the court to reconsider Obergefell. They say they'd really love to have a case to reconsider Obergefell, just not that particular case. But other members of the court are not doing that. I think when the Supreme Court reversed Roe versus Wade in the Dobbs decision just 2 years ago, Justice Clarence Thomas put that view in writing again. We know that Justice Alito shares that view, but the others are not saying anything similar. And so I think what's important for folks to know is that although there are calls on the far right for the Supreme Court to reverse Obergefell, that's not something that has public support. Public opinion, as I said, is around 70%. There are no calls from the White House to do that. The Southern Baptist Convention, which is a very, very conservative religious group, has been hostile to LGBTQ people forever, has passed a resolution saying that they should focus on trying to get the court to revisit Obergefell, but it's not something that has a lot of momentum. I think what's key for people to have in mind at the moment is, number one, there's no case in front of the Supreme Court pending for court review at this moment, and the Supreme Court can't review a case and consider a case without there being a case, and there is none at this point. Also, the Congress passed in 2022 the Respect for Marriage Act. That's a statute, and it's a statute that uses the power that our Constitution gives to Congress to tell states how they have to interact with each other. It's called the Full Faith and Credit Clause. And the Constitution tells Congress to give instructions to the state about what they have to respect. The Respect for Marriage Act says, for purposes of federal law and for purposes of interstate relationships, valid marriages of same-sex couples and of interracial couples, by the way, have to be respected. So as long as there are some states that allow same-sex couples to marry, other states have to honor those marriages. So even if at some future time Obergefell were to be overturned, and even if some states were to be hostile to same-sex couples who want a license to marry in that state, and we know there are states who at this point have that view, they still would have to respect the marriages that same-sex couples either have already celebrated or would celebrate in friendly states. And there's a bunch of friendly states. So, I think the bottom line is that we have to keep our eye on this. We know that there are those on the far right who want to raise money on this issue, want to gin up fears on this issue, use it for organizing. That's not new. There may be some support on the far right for focusing on this because there was some success seeking reversal of Roe versus Wade. These issues are different. And, Lambda Legal works hard to protect reproductive health rights. No question about that. These are different issues and they play out differently, and they play out differently in the courts. So people should not be panicking, but they should be paying attention. And Lambda Legal is not panicking, but we are paying close attention. That's what we do. That's what we're here for. And we have some other advice for folks to we always like to remind people to think about their legal rights, including whether they want to get married or not.
Well, we'll come back to that later. But before we do, I'm going to go off camera in just a second so you can, our audience can meet two of those heroic plaintiffs who helped bring us marriage equality, working with Camilla. So I'm going to go off camera, and Camilla, hand the microphone to you.
Thank you, Kevin. I am thrilled to introduce Kate and Trish Varnum. They are the Varnums of Varnum versus Breen, which is the lawsuit that bears their name. And when they filed their lawsuit in Iowa, there was only one state in the country that allowed same-sex couples to marry, and that was Massachusetts. They had the bravery and the vision to participate in a marriage lawsuit in the heartland. And we are so grateful to have you with us to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of Obergefell, a decision to which you contributed with your early victory in Iowa.
Thank you. Thank you. We're glad to be here. Yeah, thank you.
So Jenny and I would like to alternate asking you a few questions about your experience, and I'll go first. What was life like for you both prior to the Iowa Supreme Court's ruling in 2009 vindicating same-sex couples' freedom to marry in your home state?
Well, in 2004, we had a commitment ceremony. And prior to that, we were planning it. We'd been planning it for over a year. And friends of ours, the Massachusetts decision had come down already. And marriage licenses were being given in San Francisco. And we had friends saying, oh, you should go to Massachusetts. You should go to San Francisco and get married there. We said, we don't live there. We live in Iowa. And if anything ever comes to Iowa, we will happily participate. We'll go knocking on doors. We'll stand at farmers markets and get signatures, whatever we needed to do, because we wanted to be married. When we had our commitment ceremony, we said we're as married as we can be. There was always that asterisk. We were married in our faith. We were married to our family and friends, but we weren't married legally to our state or to our country.
My father-in-law had a great term that he used. He said, in another time and another place, I'd call you my daughter-in-law or daughter-in-law. But in this time and in this place, I call you my daughter-in-love. So that kind of tells you where we're at that time and place.
And how did life change for you after the Iowa Supreme Court ruling that vindicated your freedom to marry in your home state?
Well, we were thrilled. It was unimaginable. It was, I still remember that day and just float, because that's how magical it was.
Yeah. We had our legal wedding a few months later, and it felt like a continuation of the vows we'd made 5 years before, but we still had that asterisk because we were married in Iowa and a couple other states, but we weren't married when we traveled outside of Iowa. When just crossing the border, we weren't married.
It's been nice being married to you.
Yeah. We weren't married in the eyes of the federal government. So it was tough, but I think it felt like a vindication. It felt like an acknowledgement of the commitment that we've made to each other.
But what people probably don't realize is, even after that, when we were filing our taxes, Kate and I still had to file 3 tax returns for the federal. One for her, one for me. And then because Iowa acknowledged our marriage, we had to file a joint prepare a joint return so that they could determine our Iowa taxes. So there was a financial disadvantage still there because of that.
Well, that point leads right to what I was about to ask you both, which is, so, we've had a reference to the U.S. Supreme Court decision in 2013 in the Windsor case that was about the federal discriminatory marriage law. And then 2015, of course, the Obergefell decision in the U.S. Supreme Court. And so how did those U.S. Supreme Court decisions affect you, both in practical terms and whatever that it might have meant to you just as a statement of for the nation?
When the Windsor case was decided, we were able to, like Trish said, we were able to file our taxes correctly. And we weren't considered strangers to the federal government. That was a big deal for us. And then, of course, other states by then had marriage equality. So we felt safer traveling. When Obergefell was decided, before Obergefell was decided, our son was born. He was born in a state in Texas, where they did not recognize same-sex parents. We finalized our adoption here in Iowa, but when we contacted the state to get a corrected birth certificate, they said, we don't recognize same-sex parents, choose a mother.
How do you choose a mother? We're both his moms.
Yeah.
And he'll tell you that.
He'll tell you that. So when Obergefell was decided, we contacted Texas again, and it was very reluctant, I think, on their part to send us the right paperwork, because initially they sent us the wrong paperwork. And I think we believe that was intentional. But we were able to get the right paperwork to get his birth certificate corrected. But, it took a few years from the time he was born. But being able to say that we were married with no asterisk by then was a big deal for us. We felt that we could travel freely to other states without having to have extra paperwork saying, yes, she can be with me if something happens, or I can be with her. We've had situations like that before we were married, where we couldn't be with each other in times of need. We feel like our marriage is complete, is fully recognized. And I know that took a lot of work, and it's going to continue work. Our marriage should only be between us. It should not have external influence like that. So.
It was certainly a validation.
Yes.
Could you both walk us through what it was like to be the lead plaintiff in an early marriage equality case? What was your journey like?
Well, Camilla, when we asked what it would entail, you said maybe a little more publicity.
We asked you
We did.
because I wanted to know. We wanted to know. And it's still surreal, to be honest with you, because we see our name associated in these cases and we're like, oh,
That's us.
that's us.
It's hard. It's hard for us.
We're just Kate and Trish. We are not, you were talking all these things, heroics and everything, and all we wanted to do was get married. That's all. And that's still all it is. I mean,
not just get married, but be married.
be married and to have our family and to be acknowledged as such. Because as we've said before, nobody grows up saying, hey, I want to be in a civil marriage. I want to be civil unioned. No, I want to be married. And that's a term that everybody understands. And that's what we are.
And we wanted for our child to have that recognition that he had two parents that love him and are recognized as his parents.
But we didn't want it just for us. We want it for everybody because everybody deserves that right.
Thank you. So, do you have any perspective on why Lambda Legal's work is so important? I think, Trish, you kind of just answered that question, really. But do you have any messages, perhaps, for the folks who are listening in?
Yeah. It wouldn't have been possible without Lambda Legal. They walked us through this. They had our backs. They were right there leading us as we went. And all I can tell you is, honestly, if it wasn't for Lambda Legal, we would not be here today where we are. We would not have marriage. We would not have a lot of the rights that our community has, whether it's marriage or not. I can't stress the importance of the work that they've done. I can't express the importance of the work and the relationships that they've built. That whole group of folks that came to Iowa, that stayed with us, that held our hands, that walked, that
Supported us
all the way through. It's those folks are family. But their work is more important than anything I can tell you right now.
Well, you inspired us more than we can possibly express. And to know you is to love you. And we are just so grateful to you for your leadership and your early vision.
Back at you.
Yes.
Well, you're telling your story and participating as you did, and perhaps participating as you did a little bit because there was no way to foresee how much of a spotlight there would actually be. I mean, it was a really bright spotlight and lots of people. I mean, your case marked a really important turning point in the movement of demonstrating to the country as a whole that this was not just a coastal phenomenon and that, we are everywhere and that every state has a constitution and it matters. I feel like what you've been talking about has given people a sense of what's at stake. I wonder, here we are 10 years after Obergefell, 16 years after your case. What are your concerns for our community, or what would you want people to know from your perspective, why this still matters and what your concerns might be for the issue and the community?
My fear is apathy. We saw that in California with Prop 8. They were given exactly what they wanted and then they had it snatched away. It's that easy. It's not probably as easy as it was then, but we haven't won the war. We've won the battles, but this is a long-term thing that isn't going to go away. We're still fighting civil rights. So how are we going to say that this isn't going to come up again? I don't want to see that happen. I think that if we become apathetic, then we're going to find out that we lose a lot.
Yeah. We're in a bit of a testing time.
Exactly.
We are. It's scary right now.
It is scary.
It's very scary.
But it's encouraging that, we still have 70% like you said earlier, Jenny, 70% support.
Mhm.
What's scary is if that number goes down and the people that are in power seize onto that apathy, that decrease in acceptance, and take it and run with it. We've seen it on other issues in Iowa and across the country where they've seized on that fear and that ability to turn over civil rights issues. And that's scary to us. But what gives me hope is that there are still people out there in pockets of communities that support us and are willing to support us and are vocal about supporting us. Not just Kate and Trish, but our community as a whole.
And I will say that while we're discussing marriage right now, that's not the only thing at stake.
Right.
We have issues. Our transgendered community is under attack, and we need all of the allies that we have and more.
Mm-hmm.
We can't let that slide.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very well said.
What brings you and your family the most joy?
Spending time together.
Yeah.
That we have a good time, the three of us together. Our son is our life, and he makes us laugh. He frustrates us. He's 13, so anyone with a 13-year-old child can tell you that it can be a challenge. But
watching him grow
Yeah.
into the human that he's going to be is amazing.
Yeah.
And I see flashes of what he's going to be in his future self. And all I can say is, this is the kid that outed us when he was in preschool, 3 years old. I have 2 moms, proudly.
Yeah.
So he's going to be a force to be reckoned with.
so look out, world.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And in looking at the milestone 10-year anniversary of nationwide marriage equality, do you have any particular thoughts about what people should keep in mind, or can you bring people back a little bit to what it was like before and how things have changed?
How it was before. So before 10 years ago, our rights felt very fragile. They're still fragile. It's still very fresh, even though people will say, oh, 10 years, you've had marriage equality for so long. It's 16 years for Iowa.
It doesn't seem like that long. It seems like yesterday.
Yeah. It's still recent history for us. And I hope that people understand that this is like I said, our rights are very fragile and we need to keep them, and we need to support each other and Lambda Legal and work on keeping states and the federal government from overturning this.
Celebrate the victories. We have those. Celebrate the heck out of those, because you need to do that. You need to live, but the work continues.
Yeah.
And let's not forget that. And that we need people like the folks at Lambda Legal, at the ACLU. We need those people. Don't let them down either. Support them all you can.
Well, here's a last question that just flows exactly from what you were just saying. It sort of wraps it all up, but we've sort of touched on the reality that there are, elected folks in legislatures, state legislatures, Congress, judges. They're judges, who are people too. Is there a message that you'd like to send to them about the importance of maintaining, securing, reinforcing the freedom to marry for same-sex couples and the families led by same-sex couples?
I would say you can't legislate us away. You can't pass laws to ban us out of existence.
We've always been here. We're always going to be here.
And we're going to keep fighting.
Yeah. You're talking about our lives.
Like we said, when we were planning our commitment ceremony, we are willing to knock on doors. We are willing to talk to people. We will continue doing that. I mean, our decision came down 16 years ago. Obergefell came down 10 years ago. We're still talking about it, and we're still willing to talk about it.
Tell your stories.
Yep.
That's what's going to make the impact.
Yep.
And our legislators are not going anywhere. We're here.
Well, we want to thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Camilla.
Kate and Trish, you were just phenomenal. I did a lot of theater in college, and you were always told never share the stage with dogs or kids. And Lambda Legal, our line is never share the stage with plaintiffs because they are so amazing that we all pale by comparison. So
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
To transition back to what people can do, Jenny, as you know, there are a lot of people really nervous out there, and you warn people to be concerned but not panicked. If people are concerned, what steps should they take right now to protect themselves?
Yeah, so this is a really good moment to focus on what your family needs might be. There are people who have been thinking about getting married and have been putting it off, and maybe this is a moment when you want to take that step or at least have a conversation. There's some couples who have recognized that it's time for the legal relationship to come to an end. And this may be a moment to look into that too, because there are some states that are looking at making no-fault divorce more difficult. I think that the top area for people to think about is the ways that you can put your wishes in writing, because, marriage is a default package of rights and responsibilities, and it's incredibly helpful in all sorts of situations where you need an answer. The law or relatives or people need to know who gets to make a decision, who gets to do something with respect to another person. But sometimes our individual wishes or our family wishes are different, and there's an opportunity to meet with a lawyer. And it's not just that we think that everybody should spend lots of time with lawyers, spend more time with lawyers, but good legal advice to put your wishes in writing can really be helpful, because if you don't do that, people may not know. And that what may be right for your own family may not be the default thing. And the other thing, and Trish and Kate, you've been talking about your son, for same-sex couples raising kids. Well, there's generally some legal presumptions about the parental relationships between parents and kids, but sometimes they can be challenged. And sometimes doing a second parent adoption or some other formal legal step to make those parent child ties extra secure can be a really good idea. It can sometimes involve more expense. It's kind of intrusive, kind of a pain in the neck, but it can really pay off in a situation where some kind of crisis strikes. If you can, find a lawyer, somebody that has some expertise or is licensed where that's quite important. If you want some guidance to try to find somebody in your area, please feel free to call our legal help desk. Just go to our website, and it's the banner right at the top of the website shows you how to get to our legal help desk, where we have attorneys who often have contact information for attorneys in different parts of the country. And we have legal resources available on our website to give some guidance. You don't have to have taken a bunch of notes of what I said just now. We have legal resources writing out some of these issues that are posted on our website. So, please take advantage of that. These are important types of family planning measures, life planning measures to take. And, sometimes, I've always said, flowers and chocolate are great at Valentine's Day, but actually nothing says I love you more than actually doing those legal documents to protect the person that you love. I know this makes lawyers not seem terribly romantic, but really it's true. It's a way of saying I love you.
Well, we're getting near the end of our time. We have included some links to resources in the chat. If you haven't looked at that, please take a look and do avail yourself of help from our help desk. I'm going to let the lawyers and plaintiffs have the last word, as they should, but I have to tell a somewhat embarrassing story before I do. The first director of Lambda Legal's marriage project was a gentleman named Evan Wolfson. And he called me up in the 90s when I was running an organization called Glisten. He said, I want to tell you about the work I'm doing. And Evan came over and met with me and explained his plan to win marriage. This is 30 years ago. And I said to him very condescendingly, "That's very nice, Evan. It's not going to happen in our lifetime." And I have never been more happy to have been completely, utterly wrong in my life. And it was because there were lawyers like Evan and Jenny and Camilla who had a dream and just wouldn't let go, wouldn't let up. And plaintiffs like Kate and Trish who were determined that their family was going to be recognized. And in this moment where it feels kind of dark for our community, I hope people will take a few minutes to dream of what an ideal world would look like. Because if you can dream it, you can make it happen. That is the ultimate lesson of marriage equality. Something that, even to somebody like me, seemed like a completely ludicrous pipe dream, can become a reality with enough persistence. If we continue to persist, we will prevail. So any final thoughts, Jenny?
Well, I want to flag for people, and Trish and Kate, you raised this issue, and it is unfortunately absolutely true that the direct and vicious attacks happening now at the federal level and in many states against our trans, non-binary, and intersex siblings and family members and beloved friends, it's very serious. We have resources on our website, some information about securing identity documents and other information about how to navigate life and protect yourself during this time for these members of our community. And I think a key idea, and again, I want to just thank you, Kate and Trish, for flagging this, that this is one community. We are all so deeply connected. It's all about sex discrimination and misogyny. We're all vulnerable to it. In all the different ways and all the beautiful ways that we are who we are, with all our wonderful diversity and differences. And so we encourage people to go to the website and our social media, follow our social media and get those resources if they're relevant to you, and call our legal help desk if you have questions or concerns. We have lawyers there with information to share with you, and know that we are with you. As Kevin, as you always say, Lambda Legal has your back.
Camilla.
Well, it's hard to follow you both. I'm just blown away by the opportunity to spend time with Kate and Trish again, and remembering to bookend this conversation a bit from the beginning when we were talking about Scrimeti. At the time that Kate and Trish stood up so bravely, we did not enjoy public support, majority support for the freedom to marry. And we are in that same vulnerable moment right now with respect to transgender Americans. And Kate and Trish introduced themselves to the American public and brought us along, helped us immeasurably. We're at the same point now in a fight for freedom, autonomy, for equality, for transgender people. We will win that fight with the help of incredibly brave plaintiffs, just as Kate and Trish were. And we fight on.
Kate and Trish, you get the last word.
Kevin, I wanted to tell you, you're not alone. We went to see a comedian whom we were in the process of getting him to sign our book, or his book. And we told him that about the case in Iowa. And he said, it'll never happen.
It was about a month before the decision came down.
Let me tell you, the guy, I'm not a fan any longer. He made me so angry. The pictures that we have with him even show that. So I was so happy that we could prove him wrong. Yeah. But it takes a village. And we need everybody. We need Lambda. We need your support. We need brave plaintiffs. We need folks that can stand up and tell their stories. It may not be the easiest thing that they think that they've ever done, but it will be the most rewarding once they're successful.
And the work is going to continue.
Mm-hmm. So. And as Camilla said, we're going to win.
You're absolutely right. It takes a village. I want to thank the hundreds of people who logged on to join us tonight, our most loyal supporters. We couldn't do any of this work without your support. Please stay tuned for future such programs. And thank you for supporting Lambda Legal. Take care. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.